Imagine this. You're at a hotel front desk. You want to check your booking. You ask, "What day is it today?" The clerk says, "Thursday." But that's not the answer you wanted. You wanted the number, the date. So you try again and say, "What date is it today?" The clerk understands you, but something about the question feels slightly off.
And that kind of thing happens all the time. A learner builds a sentence that makes perfect sense logically and people understand it. But it still doesn't sound like the sentence most people would naturally use.
Welcome to Sammy's English in Asia. We focus on real English, not just what is possible, but what people actually say in everyday conversation. I'm Teacher Sammy.
And I'm Jonathan. Today, we're looking at a question that seems simple. How do you ask for the date? Not a date, mind you. That's a different discussion.
But underneath that simple question, there's a much bigger idea about how spoken English works, especially how you avoid confusion when you speak it or hear it.
Because learners often learn in patterns. You see things like, "What time is it?" "What day is it?" Or, "What year was that?" So naturally you think, okay, then I can say, "What date is it?" Right?
Yes, it feels tidy, it feels consistent, it feels logical, it feels like the language should behave consistently.
And in a way, from a learning perspective, that expectation makes sense.
It does. But real spoken English doesn't always follow those neat patterns. It's shaped by use, not by logic alone.
And that's where things start to move away from what learners expect.
In everyday conversation, clarity often matters more than symmetry.
So if two expressions are easy to confuse, speakers don't just rely on careful pronunciation.
Right. They often change the grammatical structure itself.
And here, the problem is day and date.
Yes, if someone is speaking quickly, those two can sound very similar. If that final sound isn't clear, the listener may not know which one you said. And that's often true of English learners whose native language is, for example, Chinese.
And in real life, conditions aren't perfect, and people are not always listening carefully.
Exactly. People are distracted. There's background noise. Someone is speaking quickly. Maybe two conversations are happening at once. All the things that make communication less controlled.
So instead of depending on a small sound difference, English often moves toward a clearer structure. And this is where the natural versions come in.
Right. Instead of, "What date is it today?" most people say, "What's today's date?" Or maybe even, "What is the date today?"
That's probably the most common fixed version.
It is, but you may also hear, "What's the date today?"
Which also sounds completely natural.
Yes, both of those are used in real conversation.
So this is not a situation where only one form is correct.
Exactly. It's more about preference and habit.
But both are better than "What date is it today?"
Yes, because they avoid that potential confusion with day.
Let's make this more concrete. Imagine you're in an office filling out a form. There's a blank space for the date. You turn to someone and ask, "What's today's date?"
That sounds completely natural. It's immediate. Nobody pauses to think about it.
Or you might say, "What's the date today?"
Also perfectly fine.
Now imagine you say, "What date is it today?"
People will probably understand, but there's often a very slight hesitation, almost like the brain needs an extra moment to confirm what you meant.
Yes, it creates just a bit more processing effort.
And that tiny delay is exactly what spoken English tries to avoid.
So we're not saying that the original sentence is wrong.
No, it's understandable, but it's not the form people naturally reach for.
And over time, those small differences matter. Let's imagine a slightly different situation. You're in a busy train station. It's noisy. Announcements are playing. You ask someone, "What date is it today?" They hear, "What day is it today?" and answer, "Wednesday."
Now you have to correct the conversation.
Right. You say, no, the date.
That extra step is exactly what speakers try to avoid.
But if you say, "What's today's date?" it's much harder to mishear.
Yes, the structure itself helps carry the meaning.
So this is really the key idea.
A sentence can be correct, but still not be the best choice for real communication.
Because communication isn't about being logical.
It's about being clear.
Let's move beyond today. What if I'm asking about an event, like a meeting? What sounds natural?
Then people usually say something like, "What's the date of the meeting?"
And that sounds smoother than, "What date is the meeting?"
Yes, again, it avoids that same pattern that can create confusion or hesitation.
So English is quietly steering away from that structure.
Exactly, not by rule, but by habit.
Here's a situation. We're planning a wedding next month. Oh, nice. What's the date of the wedding?
That fits perfectly. It sounds natural and appropriate to the situation.
Or if the context is already clear, you might simply ask, "What's the date?"
Right. Because context carries part of the meaning.
So the language doesn't need to be fully explicit every time? Now, here's where things get even more interesting. In many situations, people don't ask about the date directly at all,
Yes, they start with when.
which is much more flexible.
Exactly. When allows the conversation to develop naturally instead of forcing a precise question immediately.
Let's take a travel example. You know that your friend is taking a trip. You ask your friend, "When are you leaving?" He says next Monday. Now you might pause, think for a second, and then ask, "What's the date?"
That sequence feels very natural.
And you could also say, "What date is that?"
Yes, that works well in follow-up questions. It reflects how people actually think, step by step.
Instead of trying to construct a perfect question from the start,
Yes, real conversation is incremental.
that's a really important point. Learners often feel pressure to say the exact, complete question immediately.
But real conversation doesn't work that way. People adjust as they go.
Right, so instead of building one perfect question, people build the conversation step by step. They ask something general first,
And then refine it if needed.
which actually makes communication easier.
Much easier, but is very different from how learners often think.
Right.
Learners sometimes expect full, well-formed sentences all the time.
But real conversations are often built from short exchanges.
This is also important for listening. Real conversations often sound like, "When are you going?" "On Monday." "Monday the 10th?"
And that kind of back and forth is completely normal.
It's how meaning gets built collaboratively, short, layered, and cooperative.
Yes, meaning is built together.
There's also a pronunciation lesson here.
Some learners think the solution is just to pronounce date more clearly.
And yes, this is very important, particularly if you're mixing up English sounds and, for instance, Chinese sounds, which will often influence prosody and phrasing.
But in real situations, pronunciation alone isn't always enough. Structure often matters more than perfect pronunciation.
Because conditions aren't controlled or ideal.
Exactly. A good sentence should work even when the sound isn't perfect.
Which is a much more reliable strategy. Let's imagine a slightly different situation.
Hello, I'm calling to confirm my appointment.
You ask, "When is my appointment?"
They might say,
"Next Thursday."
Exactly. Which could be unclear. So you ask, what's the date?
That's a very natural flow.
And much easier than trying to ask everything at once.
so if someone learned what date is it today, it's not a disaster.
Not at all. It's understandable.
But there are better options.
Yes, and they're simple. What's today's date? What's the date today?
Both natural, both useful.
So the main idea is this. English often chooses clarity over neat patterns.
Even when another form looks logical.
If something may be confusing, speakers naturally shift to a clearer structure.
And that's why these small changes matter.
Thanks for listening to Sammy's English in Asia.
We hope this episode helped you hear how real spoken English works.
And next time you need to ask for the date, you'll have a version that sounds natural right away.
See you next time.